Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here today to talk with you all and, of course, to come home to Penn. So we're going to talk today about socioeconomic inequity and what that means for children's outcomes. So, we're here at a Neuroscience Initiative Summit, right? And so it should be no surprise to all of you that early experience helps to shape our brain development. And it turns out that the brain is highly sensitive to experience, especially early in childhood. But of course, a child's experiences vary tremendously as a function of their social and economic circumstances. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how a child's social and economic circumstances work together to shape their brain development. Okay, so taking a step back, I study poverty in the brain, so let's make sure we're all on the same page. What do we mean when we talk about poverty? So poverty is defined as a lack of economic resources needed to attain a minimal standard of living. And here in the U.S., the federal government defines the federal poverty thresholds according to family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. And currently, the federal poverty line for a family of 2 adults and 2 kids is set at $30,000. Despite the fact that it's quite difficult to imagine raising a family of 4 on that amount in a city like Philadelphia. Interestingly, the federal poverty line is set the same regardless of where you are across the country. So a family of 4 here in Philly has the same poverty line as a family of 4 in New York City, which has the same poverty line as a family of 4 in rural South Dakota, even though, of course, the cost of living can be quite different across different locations. And importantly, although poverty is defined according to family income level, we know that the experience of poverty is shaped by economic opportunity, social institutions and systems, history and experiences of trauma, discrimination, and oppression. Okay. Now, when we look at poverty rates by age over time, here I'm showing you the last few years, and what we see, let's see, does this pointer work? Yes. What we see,
the screen's
too bright? Okay, that's fine. So what we see is that on average, kids are about 50% more likely to experience poverty than the general population. Now, poverty scholars tend to use the supplemental poverty measure these days, which does take into account differences in cost of living, as well as differences in generosity of the social safety net. So it takes into account family income and earnings, as well as other resources that they're getting through social programs like SNAP, for example. And what we see over time when we look at rates of childhood poverty over the last 10 years or so, so generally we see maybe a slight downward slope for most of that time. That's one thing to notice. The other thing to notice, it should be no surprise to anyone in this room, we see remarkable and consistent disparities by racial and ethnic backgrounds. We know that minoritized children are much more likely to experience poverty in the U.S., so it is not randomly distributed. And then the other thing to notice is this dramatic plummeting that happened in 2021. Now we're talking here at Wharton, so who can tell me why we saw that dramatic decrease in poverty?
COVID?
Indirectly related to COVID, right? Why would COVID have caused a dramatic decrease in childhood poverty? Yeah. For 1 year, right, the Biden administration passed the American Rescue Plan, which led to the several times stimulus payments, but most notably, it led to the expansion of the child tax credit, right? So historically, the child tax credit meant that if you earned, had an annual income up to a certain income and you had kids, you got money back on your taxes that you could use however you wanted. But critically, it was only available to those families who earned enough money to owe taxes. Right? So for 1 year, one thing that was baked into the American Rescue Plan was that the child tax credit became fully refundable. And that meant that that money was available to families regardless of whether they earned enough money to owe federal taxes. So for 1 year, we gave all families the same benefit that we give the top 75% or so of earners historically. And for 1 year, we saw childhood poverty cut in half. So regardless of what I'm about to tell you as to whether poverty is related to kids' cognitive and behavioral outcomes, we can see that childhood poverty is exceptionally malleable to policy. Then Congress let the American Rescue Plan expire, and no surprise, childhood poverty rates climbed right back up. Okay. We also talk a lot about socioeconomic status, which I will use that term interchangeably with socioeconomic disparities, socioeconomic circumstance, socioeconomic factors. And when I talk about socioeconomic circumstances, I'm talking about more than just poverty, right? Poverty is defined according to family income, sometimes according to other financial or economic resources families are getting. When we talk about socioeconomic circumstances, we're talking about income, but also things like parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that when we consider childhood socioeconomic circumstances in this way, they tend to be associated with a number of important outcomes for kids. Things like achievement test scores, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rate, to name a few. But knowing that growing up in economic disadvantage is associated with a lot of those outcomes doesn't really tell us much about why we see those associations, right? So we can think about what kinds of factors might be accounting for the association between socioeconomic disparities on the one hand and differences in children's outcomes on the other. And you all could likely think of many possibilities, right? Differences in access to healthy foods, differences in access to high-quality health care, differences in exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment or school quality or family stress. And to this laundry list and the many others that you all could likely come up with, I would say, yes, each of these has been shown to contribute in part to the link between socioeconomic factors and children's outcomes. So how do we make sense of that? Well, one way is to recognize that so-called cognitive skill is much too broad of an outcome. By which I mean that traditional achievement measures like IQ or school graduation rate aren't at all specific in terms of how our brain functions, right? We don't have a high school graduation nucleus in our brain. So we can be much more specific in thinking about which particular neurocognitive skills and corresponding brain circuitry seems to vary the most along socioeconomic lines. And that gives us a sense of which types of skills might we prioritize in targeting. Okay. So that brings us to a neuroscience approach. Neuroscience, of course, teaches us that different structures and circuits in the brain support different kinds of cognitive skills. And so by taking a neuroscience approach, we can ask which core cognitive systems vary the most along socioeconomic lines. And so that's exactly the approach that I took back when I was a graduate student here in Penn in Martha Farah's lab, when we recruited several socioeconomically diverse cohorts with children ranging in age from kindergarten on up through adolescence. And we simply asked which particular neurocognitive skills supported by distinct brain circuits seem to vary the most with parents' socioeconomic circumstances. And our results were remarkably similar across these different studies with different aged kids. So on average, from kindergarten on up through adolescence, we tended to find that socioeconomic disparities were most pronounced in children's early language skills, things like vocabulary and early reading skills, with more modest but still consistent differences in memory and certain aspects of executive functioning, which you can think of like the ability to regulate our thoughts and feelings. Okay. So building off of that early behavioral work, my research program has really focused on four main scientific questions. The first is, how do these socioeconomic disparities in children's cognitive and behavioral outcomes relate to underlying differences in children's brain structure and function? The second is, just how early are these disparities detectable, right? We reasoned if we were already seeing differences by the time kids started kindergarten, these disparities must emerge earlier, but when? Number three, which experiences, especially modifiable experiences, might be accounting for these socioeconomic disparities in children's outcomes, and is the answer different depending on the outcome you're looking at? And then finally, number four, how can this work inform interventions? Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to focus on those first three today, although I'm very happy to tell you a little bit more about our basic science investigation if people have questions. But for the rest of this talk, I'm really going to focus on how we might use this work to inform interventional approaches. Okay. So as we said early on, we know that growing up in poverty puts kids at risk for a host of outcomes that we care about, right? Things like lower school achievement, lower educational attainment, lower earnings when they grow up, physical and mental health challenges across the lifespan, and even differences in brain structure and function. But what we don't know is whether changing family income would make a difference. Okay. So work by my social science colleagues suggests that indeed changing family income might be a promising approach. So this is work by Greg Duncan and colleagues who found that across several different studies, the difference of just $4,000 in annual family income between the prenatal year and age 2 was associated with a number of positive outcomes for kids. Things like higher school achievement scores, increased adult earnings when those children grew up, increased time spent employed in the labor force, and even some evidence for improved health when those kids grew up. But we all know the adage, correlation is not causation, and so we can't say for sure from this work whether income in and of itself is causing differences for children. And the gold standard for a scientific study design that really lets us infer causality is a randomized controlled trial. So I'm really happy to be one of the principal investigators of the Baby's First Year study, which is the first randomized controlled trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. This is very much a multidisciplinary team effort. It's 7 principal investigators who come from economics, developmental psychology, social policy, and neuroscience. We've been working together on this project for more than a decade now, in the hopes of really being able to say something meaningful about the causal impact of income. So what have we been doing? Well, the study design is actually pretty straightforward. Back in the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 mothers who were experiencing low income, and we recruited them in the postpartum wards of hospitals just a day or two after they gave birth. Now, upon enrolling in the study, all of the mothers were offered the opportunity to receive a monthly, unconditional cash gift that they're free to spend however they would like with no restrictions. But critically, the moms were randomized into one of 2 groups. So the group that we call the high cash gift group is receiving $333 a month, or $4,000 a year. And the group that we call the low cash gift group is receiving $20 a month, or $240 a year. So that difference amounts to a difference of approximately $4,000, which, as I showed you on the last slide, has been associated with improvements in children's outcomes. So it was an amount that we thought stood some chance of moving the needle. And it was also an amount that we thought held some policy relevance, in that it's similar in size to other social services and benefits that moms experiencing low income are likely to qualify for. So it's approximately the amount of the average SNAP or food stamp benefit. It's similar in size to the earned income tax credit as well. Now, to date, we've put more than $8 million into the pockets of the moms in our study. And by measuring what happens to the children and families in these 2 randomly assigned groups, we can actually estimate the causal impact of this poverty reduction intervention on a host of child and family outcomes. The recruitment took place in 4 metropolitan areas and several hospitals in each of these sites, and random assignment happened within site. So within site, we had randomization to 40% high cash gift group, 60% low cash gift group, and then we'll be analyzing all of the impacts using an intent to treat framework. All right, so who ended up in this sample? So it was, as we had hoped, as we had planned, a racially and ethnically diverse sample across all of the sites. About 40% of the moms self-identify as Black, about 40% self-identify as Latina. At baseline, about 1 in 5 reported being married. By design, this was a low-income sample. One of the eligibility criteria was that they had to self-report income at or below the poverty line in the last year. So the average household income was around $22,000. The vast majority reported receiving some kind of government benefit. And importantly, randomization seems to have been successful. So they were balanced across a host of baseline characteristics, 27 baseline characteristics that we measured. Do we usually do questions? I'm happy to, but...
If you could wait till, yeah.
Okay, so you'll be first. Okay. All right. You may have noticed I've been using the term cash gift. That's intentional. These do meet the legal definition of a gift in that we're not asking for anything in return, right? So a mom can choose to never participate in research again, and obviously we try to incentivize her not to do that, but she'll still get the cash gifts even if she chooses not to participate in research, right? So it's not employment, it's a gift. The gifts are distributed on a debit card branded the For My Baby card. The card was activated in the hospital at the time that the mom enrolled in the study. The first disbursement was put on the card right then, so she walked out of the hospital with her first month's gift right there on the card. She could start spending it that day. And it's automatically reloaded each month on the day of the child's birthday. So my firstborn was born on May 27th. If I were a mom in the study, it would mean that on the 27th of each month, my card would get reloaded. The disbursements are also accompanied by a text message reminder letting the mom know that she has new funds on the card. The gifts were all funded by charitable sources, right? NIH was excited about the study. They said, yes, put in a grant for the evaluation, but you got to go fundraise for the gifts themselves yourself. Because they were gifts, it meant that they are not taxable to the moms. Therefore, we did not have to collect Social Security numbers or tax ID numbers. And finally, I will say that we worked very hard before recruiting our first mom to ensure that to the extent possible, this money wouldn't count in determining mom's eligibility for other government services and benefits, right? And there were a few reasons for that. Obviously, it would be extremely ethically problematic if we enrolled moms in the study and then they systematically lost their SNAP benefits or housing vouchers. And it would be a scientifically terrible design, right, if we were giving out different amounts of money, but the high cash gift group were systematically losing more benefits. So I mentioned that we launched the study in 2018. We actually began planning this in 2012. And a big part of that long on-ramp was for this consideration. So practically, what did this mean? And this, I should say, was work led by two of the other principal investigators, Catherine Magnuson and Lisa Janetian. So practically, this meant that in 2 of our 4 cities, we pursued waivers, agency by agency in those cities, saying that, you know, for these moms in this city, this money won't count in determining their eligibility for SNAP, for example. And in the other 2 cities, we actually worked with partners to get state legislation passed saying that for these moms in this study, this money wouldn't count in determining their eligibility for benefits. Okay. Now, how did we anticipate that the cash support would lead to changes in families' lives? So we hypothesized and pre-registered 2 main pathways. The first we call the increased investment pathway. And that is really sort of a what money can buy pathway. So that's the idea that if moms have greater economic resources, they're more likely to be able to afford things like books and toys, perhaps higher quality childcare, perhaps better housing and safer neighborhoods. Okay. And the other we call the reduced stress pathway. And this is the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to make that monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to report lower levels of stress, perhaps better mental health, perhaps be better enabled to engage with their children in the kinds of warm and nurturing ways that we know are difficult to do when stressed and that are so important for child outcomes. Actually, I'll say one more thing on that slide. You know, one of the beautiful things about money is that it empowers families to use it how they see fit, right? So chances are these different pathways operate very differently in different families. So we're measuring those pathways carefully along the way, acknowledging that there's likely to be heterogeneity there. Okay. With apologies for the busy slide, I'm going to quickly walk you through our timeline of data collection, which is important in thinking about some of the results. So I mentioned we began recruiting the moms in 2018. We recruited them over the space of a year in the postpartum wards of hospitals. Subsequently, we've been following up with the families annually around the time of the children's birthdays. So the initial first birthday visit started out in families' homes. We asked if we could visit them at home, to ask mom some questions, to watch her play with her child and with her permission, video record the play to code for various parenting behaviors. We took a measure of mom's stress hormone. We got her to tell us a little bit about how the child was developing. And we got a measure of brain activity right there in the homes that I'll tell you about in a few moments. Things were going along great when March of 2020 rolled along, and obviously it was no longer safe or feasible for us to travel into these families' homes. Now, I'm happy to say we were able to pivot very quickly. I think our last home visit was on a Friday, and by Monday we were collecting survey information by phone. So overall, our retention rate for the first birthday wave was great. It was 931 out of the 1,000 moms participated. So in terms of keeping in touch with families, that's remarkable. But of course, we had a lot less data for those rich in-person measures that weren't safe to do once the pandemic started. Likewise, the second and third birthday waves of data collection took place over the phone. So we conducted phone surveys, again, had greater than 90% participation, which is great. When we had originally launched the study, we had planned for it to be a study of the first 3 years. So our original plans were that at age 3, we would invite the families into our university research labs and conduct an in-depth assessment of child development in person. Sometime early in the age 2 wave, we realized this still might be going on for a while, and we weren't sure we'd be able to pull off bringing families into our university research spaces around the third birthday. So we went back to the funders and we said, we know you guys funded the cash gifts for 3 years, but I don't think we're going to be able to bring these families back then. Is there any way we could extend the gifts for another year till just past the 4th birthdays so that we can invite them in then? And their generosity truly knew no limits. They agreed to do that. And so we were able to push off that in-person wave of data collection until the 4th birthdays. And we just finished that in-person wave of data collection about a month ago. So we're happy about that. I'm not going to be telling you results from that last wave yet, since we're still working to clean and analyze and understand those data. But I am going to tell you a little bit about what we're learning from the first 3 years of the study. Okay, so what are we seeing so far? So first of all, the first question is simply, did it increase family income? Which on the one hand seems like, well, obviously it did. You gave them money. On the other hand, it's not immediately clear that would be the case, right? Because moms might choose to offset employment or other forms of earnings with this money. We did see about a 17% increase in household income from baseline. But notably, that increase was modest. Okay, so we only saw a 6 percentage point reduction in poverty in the high cash gift group compared to the low cash gift group. And the vast majority of families in both groups would still be considered low income, living below 200% of the federal poverty threshold. We also didn't see impacts on food security, which was low to begin with, or economic strain. So that is important to contextualize, right? This was not a large financial intervention. What about impacts on that household investment pathway that I mentioned? So here we're seeing some pretty consistent impacts along the lines of what we predicted. So the moms in the high cash gift group are reporting significantly more money spent on child-focused expenditures. We see this both in terms of their reports of how they're spending money on the survey, as well as in the transactions on the card. 90% of the moms gave us permission to track the transactions. We're seeing more consumption of fresh produce at age 2 in the kids in the high cash gift group compared to the low cash gift group. No statistically detectable cutting back of employment. And notably very low frequency of money spent in either group on alcohol or tobacco, and no significant differences between groups. So absolutely no evidence that the cash gifts sparked increased use of or spending on substances. And you can see the papers that support those data on our website. The preprints are available when the papers haven't yet been published. What about the maternal stress pathway? Well, counter to our hypotheses, we're really not seeing movement there. So really no evidence that we're seeing reductions in stress or better mental health in the high cash gift group compared to the low cash gift group. No improvements in romantic or co-parent relationship quality, possibly even some signs of higher parenting stress. So some surprises for us there. We can talk during the Q&A or the panel about why that might be. I think the very short answer is likely there are some aspects of people's experiences, like racism and discrimination, that are unlikely to be affected by cash. What about impacts on parenting? Much like material investments, we're seeing that moms are investing time in their children. So moms in the high cash gift group are reporting spending more time engaged in developmentally supportive behaviors like reading and playing with their kids. And finally, what about the impacts on the children? So the only direct child assessments I can tell you about are from that first birthday wave when we measured brain activity in the home. And you'll recall that was only with the kids who we were able to reach before the onset of the pandemic, so somewhat limited statistical power. Briefly, how do we measure infant brain activity? We use a technique called EEG, electroencephalography, which involves this child sitting comfortably on their caretaker's lap with this cap of electrodes on their scalp. You could think of those electrodes similar to microphones listening in to the brain's activity, the speed of the communications from one cell to the next. Obviously, we're not mind readers. We don't know what a child's thinking, but we're able to measure the speed of brain activity across the scalp. And we use computer software to decompose this signal into oscillations that occur in different frequency bands. We all have some high frequency or fast-paced brain activity, some low frequency or slower paced brain activity, but we care about the relative amounts of those different frequencies of brain activity for a few reasons. So first of all, past work by other groups has suggested that as kids get older, they tend to develop more fast-paced or high-frequency brain activity. So it's a signal of neural maturation. We also know, again, past work from other labs has suggested that in many cases, kids who are at risk for learning and attention problems in school tend to show less fast-paced brain activity and more slow-paced brain activity. And finally, and most relevant to today, we also know past work from other groups has suggested that in many cases, kids growing up in poverty show less fast-paced brain activity than their more advantaged peers. And so we reasoned and hypothesized and pre-registered that perhaps the cash gifts would reverse this pattern. And specifically, we hypothesized that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more fast-paced brain activity and less slow-paced brain activity compared to the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. And so preliminarily, after the first year of monthly unconditional cash support, that's indeed what we saw, with the infants in the high cash gift group on the left showing more fast-paced and very fast-paced brain activity. That's activity in the beta and gamma frequency bands, if there's any physiologists here, compared to the infants in the low cash gift group. Okay. Now, I put out that caveat that this is only in the infants who we were able to reach before the onset of the pandemic. Our statistical power was a lot less than we had hoped it would be, so this was significant before, but not after a multiple comparison adjustment. However, when we look at which particular regions are driving this, we see it specifically in the frontal and central regions that we know support the development of thinking and learning. So the regions where these links between poverty and brain activity have previously been reported. And in the regional analyses, they do survive adjustment for multiple comparisons. Now, this finding got quite a lot of attention in the media and elsewhere. Of course, we're happy to have a spotlight on our work, but we very much are looking forward to continuing to learn from the study. So what's happening now? Our age 4 data analysis is underway. We expect to be able to share results on that within the next year. I will also very briefly tell you that we have a qualitative sub-study where a subset of mothers are participating in repeated in-depth qualitative interviews to tell us how those cash gifts actually affect their day-to-day lives. And over, we hear from the moms about the importance of joy. Okay. We have since gone back to our funders who, again, in their unlimited generosity, have agreed to extend the cash gifts for an additional and what we plan to be the final 2 years. So we're planning to give the gifts fully through just past children's 6th birthdays so that we can understand the impact of a full 6 years of monthly unconditional cash support on children's outcomes. So really looking at the entire period before children start formal schooling. We'll bring them back into the lab at age 6, and again 2 years later at age 8, because it's going to be important to understand the extent to which any impacts persist beyond the cessation of the cash support. We're often asked, what are the policy implications of this work? Certainly it's our hope that babies' first years will be able to provide evidence of the effects of monthly cash support on children and families. It's very clear that the policy landscape has changed dramatically since we first started planning the study. You know, people used to tell us 10 years ago there's no way the federal government would ever consider going back to cash handouts. At least for 1 year, that's essentially exactly what they did. So it's our hope that we'll be able to inform debates on the generosity or cuts, both to existing programs and potential new safety net programs. Now, I would never want to suggest that income is the only or even the most important factor in determining child development. Of course not. But it may be one that's particularly malleable to policy. That said, it's also really important to recognize that cash support alone is not going to eliminate or address the structural vulnerabilities that families facing poverty experience every day. So thank you very much for your attention.